Hello, everyone. Today I'm with Stephani Stephens, and Stephani is author of the book C.G. Jung and the Dead. So, welcome, Stephani.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you, John.
Stephani, when this morning I was thinking, this is just a bit of marketing advice.
I love it.
Probably not what you expected when you came on here today, but I
No.
was thinking you could have called it Jung and the Grateful Dead, and you would have got all those people from the US that they would have thought it was about the deadheads, as they're called.
What an opportunity I missed.
Yes.
That's
I,
great. I never even thought of it. It's
I just
lovely.
thought I'd pass that on. So maybe, but
Much appreciated.
we are going to speak about, we're going to get onto your books very shortly, but I wondered whether you could tell us, I often like to ask people a little bit about their main influences and turning points and what got you
Mm,
on to all of this in the beginning. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
sure. I think Jungians really like to share the story of more of how Jung found them as opposed to how they found Jung. It's usually
Mm.
a story of kind of fated intersection.
Yeah.
And I think I had been a Latin teacher for many years and had
Mm.
done a degree, actually 2 degrees in Latin literature, and I was teaching for a while. And I really love Virgil's Aeneid, and I've
Mm.
talked, in different audiences about the Aeneid. But there is
Mm.
something that's quite archetypal about the story arc of epic storytelling. And
Mm.
the Aeneid is an epic story, and there's this watershed book, which is directly in the middle, which is book 6. And it talks about Aeneas traveling to the underworld. And so I was very taken by this book 6. And I read different translations, and I translated different parts of it. And I talked to different classic scholars about different sections. I taught it, different sections for different exams for students. And it just always seemed to me, in an ancient mind, what is going on there? Like, was this a meditation? Was it a ritual? Was it an initiation? What was the process of going to the underworld? How did ancients conceive of this? And, we know that the Iliad the Odyssey has this wonderful section where Odysseus has a blood ritual that allows him to see his mother. But this was not a trip to the underworld, right? This was raising the dead in a ritual fashion. And so Virgil takes kind of that scene, and in homage, he does this whole other thing with it, right? In book 5, Aeneas's father appears to him. He knows Aeneas knows that his father is passed. And so he has this vision, and the vision is sent from Jupiter. And so we know that there is kind of the divine aspect to the vision. But part of what they exchange is this: come here, I've got to show you something. You have to come to the underworld. And my thinking was, well, wait a second. Certainly the connection was hard enough to get going. And now he wants him to do this trip because he wants to share something with him. So I was quite taken with that preparatory moment where then Aeneas is kind of like game. He's like, okay, let's do this, and let me get to the next stage. Let me, prepare the rituals. And at the beginning of the book 6, there's some really interesting tools that Virgil uses to get him ready. And of course, the Sibyl is such an interesting character because the Sibyl kind of serves as the guide into the unconscious or to the underworld, where whatever we want to call it. The
Yeah.
ancients actually identified the entrance to the underworld as being in this one part of Italy, near this lake. And so there are parallels. Virgil was making these parallels as in terms of a physical place. But the fact that he goes through this ritual kind of thing, and that there's this there's this nod to a labyrinth. Okay, a visual of a labyrinth. And so it cues the reader that this is going to be a journey and a process, right? And so I was very taken by the dramatics
Yeah.
of what was going on in book 6, and the fact that what Anchises wanted to show Aeneas is that, yes, his story, his life, his journey is important in the lineage of this incredible story, which is hang in there, hang in there. You are an integral part of the story of our people. You have to keep going, because if you don't keep going, this great, wonderful nation of Rome will not be, or the great, wonderful city will not be built. You are a part of the originating story.
Mm.
And so it was so obvious to me that this was about this moment of present that spoke to the past and the future in this incredibly linked way. And it came just at the time that Aeneas was faltering. He had lost his father. He had run from Troy with his wife, who actually ended up dying during this process of running out of the city. The city burned. He took whoever he could with him, his son and his father, and he grabbed the household gods, okay, which were symbolic of home. And he lost so much. He also, landed and had this affair with Dido in Carthage. And of course, that didn't end well. He got a little distracted, stayed in Carthage a little too long. And then he knew he was being called, because he had a fate. He had a destiny that he needed to answer, and he wasn't at peace because of it. So he left Carthage and he kept going. So at the time that his father dies, he's lost a lot. And he can't find the energy of the original vision, right? The energy to keep going. And so in a sense, this connection with his deceased father helps him with that energetic boost. Now, interestingly, and my supervisor for my dissertation suggested, there's an interesting parallel between Anchises and Aeneas and Jung and his father, his own father, because of course in Memories, Dreams, we have this amazing kind of reflection that he does around the dreams that he had 6 weeks after his dad's passing. And he questions deeply about what we now call bereavement dream, right? This visioning in this dream. So yes, so there are some parallels. After that, Jung really starts to think incredibly deeply about, what does it mean that I dreamt about my dead father? He's come back, and I'm dreaming about him coming back. I'm not necessarily dreaming about the dead person. I'm dreaming that he's come back. What does it mean he's come back? So this inquiry, the fact that he's entertaining this and it's not sitting well, actually spurs him to write the Zephingia lectures. And of course, he belonged to this society of kind of academic university students who got together and talked about ideas. And he wrote the Zephingia lectures about the immortality of the soul. They weren't very well received at the time, but we have a very good collection of the lectures, and they are very influenced by this dream that he had of his father.
And can you just tell us a little bit about the Odyssey? Because I think I was focusing on when he hung out with Circe for a while, and Calypso, and
Yes.
all of those kind of, and the one-eyed. Yes. But the underworld, what happened to Odysseus when he went into the underworld?
Well, there wasn't a distinct journey to the underworld. That's why Virgil was so unique in his rendition, his iteration of it. Because Odysseus, we just have in book 11, Odysseus doing this ritual with the blood. He slaughters a heifer or a goat, and he uses the blood to draw up the ghost of his mother. And of course, that allows him the connection and guidance he needs to kind of continue on. And of course, he was gone for so long. It took him, 10 years to get back to Ithaca. So yeah, it's very, very brief. And it's Virgil who says, Virgil was hired to write this book by Augustus. And Augustus says, we need a poem, like Bob Dylan, we need an anthem, right? We need an anthem to celebrate who we are right now, because we've been in lots of conflicts. We've lost a lot as a nation. We've grown. The empire has grown. And so we really need kind of a boost. And so Virgil went off to write this poem. He didn't consider it to be finished in any manner. And so he took this section of it and really, blew it out. And it's very imaginative. And it kind of serves as this, I guess, a framework for what we think about traveling to the underworld. It was the trip to the underworld. Now, Inanna does that trip, right? In Beowulf. Is that Beowulf? Am I thinking Beowulf?
I'm not
Gilgamesh.
sure.
Sorry, pardon me, Gilgamesh. So, similar kind of Gilgamesh does this with his friend, this journey to the underworld. And so this too has served as kind of a precursor to Virgil's more, detailed rendition.
It's not out on the street, in our kind of secular materialism. It's not what people necessarily sign up for, is it? That trip, because that is something that's, the underworld is the place of the ancestors. That's what you're saying, isn't it? And it's it requires. I think of James Hillman when he talks about the depth, the soul and its depth, or whatever, is that it requires a real a depth.
Yes, and the journey of it is important. That it is a journey, and not necessarily a perspective, right? It's not a perception shift necessarily. It's a journey into and out of. And of course, the only place that Jung quotes the Aeneid is from book 6, that says, going to the underworld is actually easy. It's coming back. That's the tough part, right? And that speaks to everything that Jung did, everything that he did. It was the returning of this understanding of what it means to embrace the unconscious and all that it has to offer, from a depository, if you will, of mental products that we don't work through, all the way back to ancient languages and ancient cultures that are no longer identified. So, that idea of how do you come back and integrate into what you've just said, John, people don't really relate to this kind of concept of the underworld. And partly because I think loads of people have kind of adopted a Christian or maybe a Judeo-Christian idea of the afterlife. It's a heaven or a hell.
It's morbid. It's I think Jung said something along the lines of, to know your own soul, people will do anything, rather, meaning in the sense that it is seen as perhaps a morbid thing. But I think that from everything you're saying, that what seems to me is that this connecting back to the ancestors is somehow integral to the whole thing. It's what gave him that Aeneid for that journey. That's what it's about, right?
Indeed. And it didn't go amiss for him to actually examine his own nuclear family, right? So he has his mother who has these uncanny moments, and he's like, what's going on there? And he has his father who's so dedicated to being a pastor in this very traditional way, and it didn't look to serve him or nourish You said nourish the soul, or this recognition of soul. And Jung saw that. He saw that in his father. And so you get the sense then with Freud and this very close relationship he had, that there were pressures, these psychic pressures around how to reconcile these two very different branches of the family that kind of express themselves in his mother and father. And what did that mean for him? Did it mean he was going to be an academic? And become, an academic, go to university and have that expression. But what was he going to do with this other inherited aspect, the uncanny aspect, right? And thus we have, personality 1 and 2, this one and 2.
And thus we have memories, dreams, and reflections, which wasn't published for a long time, but which begins to talk about all of these things.
Yes.
So deeply in Jung.
Yes.
And I think there was, what did he say about the unredeemed and the unanswerable and the what is it, that it's that reaching back to ask those questions, or those unredeemed questions, or whatever.
That's right. That the dead approached him, and what I kind of conceptualize this part of his development as having 5 death dreams. And one of those dreams was the ancient kind of bewigged gentlemen in these kind of 16th, 17th century wigs who were speaking to him in Latin and posing these questions. And he was kind of overwhelmed. He was very good at Latin, but he was kind of overwhelmed because he didn't know how to answer them. But he knew he had to go and answer them, right? So there was this connection between this, these inherited questions that had not been answered. So the unredeemed, unresolved, and the unanswered.
In his own family as well.
His own family, right?
Like, how do I? Questions.
Yes, indeed. Like, these were incredibly big questions. And then his own identifying his own impulses within himself. And honoring those. What did it mean to honor those? Well, it meant I had to leave the small village where I grew up in Switzerland and go and make my way, right? And so he did. And it's the archetypal journey of all of us to mature out of the various stages of development. So his next one was to go to medical school, and of course, that's when he became incredibly interested. Am I going to be a doctor or a psychiatrist, a GP or a psychiatrist? And he was so taken with this idea of, mental imbalance and what helped people live a fulfilling life, and where did people go, in terms of their unsettled issues, and are these unsettled issues pathology? Or are they a natural soul's way of individuating into our best expression of ourselves? So he took that on.
And just to go back a second with you, so okay, you're a Latin person, so this journey, I could imagine for someone who's a Latin scholar, that's kind of exciting, going into the underworld.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
You're already half there, right. With that old archaic language. And right. Then, but what was your, so you were a classic scholar, so how did you actually, or how did Jung stumble across you? Just through this study?
Yeah, so I was very taken with this book, and I kept kind of coming back to it and thinking about it. And in some way, it's very amusing that everyone calls Latin a dead language, right? And so the fact that I had, this career based on a dead language that kind of opened up, part of a way of thinking about the unconscious is kind of
that's
amusing.
Fantastic. Yeah, very cool. Yeah. And just shows that it's not, that goes to the heart of everything we're talking about, that it's not dead. It's alive dead. And teeming with
exactly.
Understanding.
Exactly. I think Hillman, you mentioned Hillman does a wonderful job telling us about the gods and goddesses who've gone underground, and that the fact that we haven't, honored the impulses of them. Now, your average Joe who's down the street doesn't necessarily relate to that, then I would say to them, well, where are your stories? What stories did you grow up on? on the land you live in, what are those stories? And of
Yeah.
course, coming back to the Aboriginals, we live on land that we acknowledge as being other people's land, and with that comes other stories. And so I'm
Yeah.
very aware that I've kind of imported this classical inherited canon while I'm living on borrowed land and where people have their own stories, right?
You
And
know,
so I think,
there was sorry, but there was a movie, Stephanie, and I can't say it was a great movie, Australia by Baz Luhrmann. But
yes.
one thing I did get from that movie, and I think maybe what he was trying to kind of transmit in that movie,
Mm,
was that we, well, I suppose Western culture thinks that they've had an influence on this land, on the Aboriginal people or whatever. And one of his things was, but how much influence has the Aboriginal dreaming had on us, and how deep is it underlying in the
mm.
background? And I think that's so interesting because it's just so much deeper and more powerful than what maybe um, we we think.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially those of us in the West who've been exposed to Western education and the Western canon,
Mm,
that leaves an awful lot out, right,
mm,
of the lineage. And so I think there's a great deal, getting back to Hillman and these ancient Greek and Roman stories. Jung read both Greek and Latin and a bit of
mm,
Sanskrit. He knew his
mm,
ancient languages, and so this was a
mm,
part of him. Okay, he was
mm,
in some respects a very good expression of the Western canon
mm.
at the time, and so I think he brings that sensibility to his psychological model, right?
Yeah,
And so when we talk about, it's interesting, this classicist Dan Ogden says, the Pentateuch, the people of the Pentateuch had very healthy relationships with their dead and their ancestors. They
yeah,
honored those ancestors. So did the Romans. So the question isn't why did they do that? The question is why don't we? And
yeah,
that's a really deep question
yeah,
that we, and not to go from, a classicist and the ancients to Barbie, the Barbie film, but
mm,
it's very telling that the first 7 minutes of the Barbie film are this unconscious celebration of life and fun until Barbie says, while she's dancing, have you guys ever thought about dying? Right? So
yeah,
suddenly death is in that moment. It's there, right?
mm,
And it stops everything. It
mm.
breaks the unconsciousness and demands of her a sense of presence to take that question.
And I mean, maybe this is a short form version, but often the midlife crisis is another way that this happens, doesn't it? Because
Mm-hmm.
it's like some of those youthful ideals, or more surface ideals, we could say in some ways,
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden there's this death rebirth going on, which uh, requires one to.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think we when we look at the maturation over the lifespan,
Mm,
when we look at sharing, we all come here the very same way. It doesn't matter if you grew up in Papua New Guinea or in the suburbs of Sydney. We all arrive into our lives in the very same way. We are birthed from a mother.
mm,
Even more contemporary ways of in vitro and that way of making the sperm and the egg and putting it together, we still arrive in the same way. So this is
mm,
seminal, this idea of birth and the idea of mother. And
yeah,
these are integral aspects to the psyche that we live with forever, right? We
mm,
live within our lives.
mm,
And as we mature, we share so much of our developmental phases with all cultures, right? We
mm,
might look and do things a little different. We speak different languages and we express ourselves differently. Maybe we prioritize certain decisions more than others, but we're kind of on this same
mm,
journey.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting that you talk about the midlife, because this was Jung's specialty. In
Mm.
fact, people would kind of tease, how can you have a psychological model that doesn't have any theory about childhood? And if you look at it, I mean, he did kind of one series of lectures on childhood dreams, but basically, it's a psychological model for the second half of life.
Mm.
And so he really felt like this, when your energy was taken up with building a life, discovering your profession, honing that profession, building a family, having children, that was all the external energy that it required,
Yeah.
your life force. And then you came to kind of the midlife. And
Mm.
then it was time to reassess everything that
And
preceded that.
somehow mortality comes into the equation, it seems.
Yeah, yes, and that the individuation starts to become more internal. There's an interiority about paying attention to our dreams, paying attention to patterns of thought, looking back at our decisions, why we made them,
Mm.
and kind of retracing our steps in order to determine how we want to, what we want to build next. I mean, this is why you have, incredible expressions by women like Hillary Clinton and Madeleine Albright and Angela Merkel. All of these women were postmenopausal women who have the energy and the life force available at that point because they had done all that building, right? And now it was time to give back in this way. And there are many, many examples. Those are just some
And
examples.
some men as well.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Um, but it's I don't know. I think like in the in the Greek tradition as well,
Mm.
with all the different gods and goddesses, that they have they have their own style and taste. And even in normal life, let's say,
Mm.
at the music festival, it's good to know that maybe there's something Dionysian going on when people dive into the mush pit, and
Yes.
it's kind of like it brings an archetypal depth to the kind of what's happening in the present, if you ask me. It's kind of it's good to know that Hermes had a particular style and taste, and Dionysus had another one, and Artemis had another one.
Yes. Yes. And it's such an interesting image that you raise about the mosh pit and diving in. And it's
You've done it.
resonant of,
Have you done that over in Canberra?
I have not done it, but I've been to many concerts, but I've never done that. But I think it's like an initiation, isn't it?
Mm.
And the ancient initiations, like at Ephesus, at Illusion Mysteries, these were about initiating us into our visionary sense, right?
Yeah,
It was about being able to open up and to see, or some call it dying before you die,
yeah,
that you have this vision of something other,
yeah.
and that changes your whole life. It
Mm.
changes your whole perception of your reality, is to
Yeah.
have that sense of vision. And so people have these archetypal peak experiences, like you're
Mm.
saying, like throwing your body and trusting. That's the radical trusting, isn't it? Throwing your body into a crowd of people and them honoring,
Mm.
and accepting. And it becomes this moment of epiphany in a way.
I think Merciali had said to be initiated is to be initiated into the first stories and myths, but I think in terms of what you're talking about too, it's to be initiated into the ancestral, and again, it's probably easy to see it. I mean, you can see it in Greece and Rome and that, but you can
Yeah.
also see it in indigenous cultures, that those
Yes.
initiation ceremonies took people back to the first original stories, myths, figures.
Yes. And in, Native American cultures, the
Mm.
vision quest
Yeah.
is all about tapping into those realms, the underworld, the unconscious, so that you can get the energy and inspiration to be able to carry on with your
Mm.
journey. And so, we see this in the Red Book, where, Jung is having this dialogue driven back and forth with the spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths and his soul. And it's all dialogue. And then finally, the spirit of the depths says, you need to go and pray and come down here and pray and awaken your dead. You need to awaken the dead. And as soon as he does this, the whole nature of the Red Book changes. It totally changes. And so not only has he initiated himself into the visionary, he's awoken the dead and everything else. He's accessed the unconscious, right?
So is that what it means? Awakening the dead means accessing the the collective unconscious, to use some jargon?
Yes. I mean, this was how I interpreted it. I mean, there might be other spins on it, but when the spirit of the depth says, come on, we've got to get going, come down here and awaken your dead. And when he conducts kind of this initiation, he initiates himself into the depths of his own psyche. And thus begins this very interesting discovery that the unconscious is both a place and a process, right? And so through this idea of active imagination, of letting yourself drop, and then bringing the external energy that you have for the outside world and applying it internally, suddenly he's awakening a whole world. And that process that he learns in active imagination is itself a process, right? It's a process. The unconscious is a process. And he writes very specifically throughout the Red Book of how the unconscious is a place as well, with colors and weather and time and journeying from one place to another. It's very specific. But it's interesting how that changes, in terms of the dead being connected to that ritual of vision. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's where he's different. I mean, this is probably going off a little, but that's where he's so different from Freud, because the dead becomes such well, it's hardly the right word, but a resource of wisdom or knowing or gnosis or whatever. Whereas sometimes we might say with Freud, the unconscious was a bit of a refuse heap for dark things. It's not that there aren't dark things or refuse, but there's this treasure, this wisdom. Well, in jargon terms, the wisdom of the ages, or the deep perennial kind of wisdom that's there. I mean, would that be one way to describe it?
Yeah. And John, as you're saying that, I'm kind of giggling, because I think there's a Talmudic saying that says, we don't see the world the way it is. We see the world the way we are. And so that's really appropriate for what you're saying about Freud's version of the unconscious. And of course, his inability to move on or to be flexible around the definition of libido was the breaking point between the two of them. Freud was incredibly focused about libido being a sexual instinct. And Jung was like, there's so much more going on besides it being a sexual instinct. There's so much more. And so it's no wonder they were friends as long as they were, because they had such a different spin on this, right? And so in a lot of respects, Jung's experiences, his own active imagination trips all through the Red Book, was him discovering where that libido was and how to use it, right? Discovering what it did in the unconscious, and of course, how to use it and how that can be really beneficial. And of course, we know the end to the tale. The end to the tale is he had all of these active imaginations day after day, month after month, for about 6 months. Then he felt better, right? He felt great. He had kind of loosened the dead. He had made peace with the dead. He had made peace with his ancestors and what they were giving him to answer. And he just felt better. And so then he was able to move on. So I think
it's like unleashed, the libido unleashed is not quite the right word because it's contained by something, as well.
Yes,
But
yes,
it's kind of, it's, when you're saying that, I think, that's when Jung becomes, it seems to me, I could be wrong, but it seems to me that he was kind of worried about being a man of science for a certain period
yes,
of time, wasn't he? And
indeed.
he
Yeah,
didn't want to get a bad reputation along the way either and all that. But then there's
indeed.
this kind of, ultimately, Jung starts to deal with timeless things, because that's what
Yes,
happens when you awaken the dead. You're talking about eternal things, timeless things,
indeed.
things that are so
Indeed.
important.
And then he really realized what you're saying, John, about timelessness. He realized as he was engaging in his own unconscious content that time became not an element. He would be in these spaces, and we know this from meditating, right? Anyone who's tried to meditate for 5 minutes, it feels like an hour and a half, and it's suddenly really kind of spooky that you can be off that far and it being a long amount of time or a short amount of time. So you have both experiences. So this idea of a timelessness and a kind of the dimensionality of the unconscious also was something that he played with. It was very intriguing to him that he could go places and see people that he recognized or not, and
Mm.
have them both reflect his daily life and be very other with respect to his daily life. Like, I'm not sure why you're here in this scene, but okay, I'll acknowledge you. So yes, I think we've learned a lot, I think, about the psyche through his hard work, his commitment to all of that. It wasn't easy work, right?
Mm.
It wasn't easy.
So, in which other ways can we, is it useful for us?
Mm.
How is it useful?
Well, I think, that's such a huge question. It's a wonderful question and it's a big question, right? I think that, we live in very fast times, right? There's been a quickening with technology, and we've been forced to live in a different way since COVID. We've been forced to reconcile some of our actions collectively, right, with climate change. And so I think these burdens have kind of a global anxiety on all of us, on the community. And so I think what's useful is to be reminded of, how our mental health is going, how our spirit is going, how are we living our lives in service, or living our lives, our destiny, right? And so one of the things, I like the way you brought up, the pressures of Jung trying to be a scientist and being very misunderstood
Mm.
in terms of that. That was a burden that he really had to carry alongside these discoveries.
Yeah.
And I think his ability to write and write, he was so prolific, right? His ability to write really had to do with that side of needing to confirm for himself. And
Mm.
in a lot of ways, we're all destined to have to answer the questions, of our own hearts and minds. Like, how do I live a life that's in alignment to myself? Right?
Yeah.
I have to
Yeah.
live in alignment to myself. And he struggled with that, living in
Yeah.
alignment. He was an intellectual, he was a learned man, he was a doctor. And also, he had the number two personality that he was very intimate with. This was a part of him. And so to deny one part of that is not to be in his living in alignment with his destiny, right? And so a lot of people say, well, what's my destiny? I don't get what you're saying. What's my fate? Well, everyone has to carve that out of the patterns and the contours of the lives that we've been living, right? That's the prima materia, right?
Mm.
Of the living that we all do. And so we're all left with that question daily, right?
It's kind of like, what does this, this is what I get when you're talking. when I wake up in the morning, I usually see an image of Donald Trump and the latest thing he said on the newsfeed. And it's
I'm
like,
sorry.
okay, we had COVID and then we have news,
Right,
like Donald Trump is going to buy Greenland or something. But this
right.
closes in on one a little in the sense that we've got this uh, crazy world situation, if
Yeah,
you want to put it that way.
yeah.
But then what I take from what you're saying is that there's always these kind of eternal questions. What does the
Mhm.
soul want, or what am I here to do, or what is my myth, or uh, what is the daemon? What are the daemons expressing? Because I remember speaking to Thomas More, and he took that whole thing of a daemonic life from the Aeneid.
Yes,
The
yes,
daemons are like presences who are there to
yes,
help, and all of
yes.
that. I don't know. It seems to me like I sometimes leave the computer when I've done, my work and things like that. And
Yes.
in the mornings, and I go down the beach and always have that hour or 2 hours. But
Mm,
I mean, one can do that at home as well. But it's that I see it as stepping away from
mm,
the kind of melee and
mm,
going back into and it somehow grounds one in those.
mm,
I mean, this
mm,
might be a vastly simplified version, but it's like they're the things that I have to keep on going back to. What does the
mm,
soul want? What should I be doing? What
mm,
is my myth? What am I living out?
mm. Yeah, I love the way you've described that, actually, about going down to the beach. We're very lucky in Australia, aren't we? We have a lot of that if we can live close by it. But I think there is this sense that we're so in obligation to others all the time, right? Whether it's family, work,
Duties.
community, country, it goes on, doesn't it? And I think it's really crafty business to be able to kind of say, well, these are my priorities. And this is what I want to feel like at the end of the day. And so this is how I'm going to feel. I'm setting that as an intention. And of course, I think that contemplative approach to one's life isn't totally beyond us, right? Even if you
No.
live in the middle of a busy Bombay, I think there's this ability to be able to tune in and to ask, am I making decisions from the deepest alignment of myself? Am I
Mm.
being true to kind of Jungian principles of my archetypes? Am I aware of what stage of development I'm in? Right?
Yeah.
Like, so, some basics, I think.
Mm.
And yeah, I think it's difficult because we know more now, right, than we did 200 years ago. Like, there's so much to know, and there's so much at our fingertips, libraries at our fingertips, right? And if we don't know, now we have AI to kind of make it up for us, right? In this kind of quick way, knowledge is become very
There's
different to consume.
and there's information, and then there's kind of gnosis or knowing, or
Yes,
um,
yes. Indeed. And of course, I love that moment in the BBC interview where they ask Jung, do you believe in God? And he kind of laughs and he
yeah.
says, I don't have to believe in God. I know. And that's really interesting if you look at those two words in Latin, the derivations of both of those words in Latin, right? So the word believe, or the Latin word for believe, is credere, which we get credit cards from, right?
Right.
And so a credit card, you don't have to pay it now,
What interest rate are those? Just by the way, I need to do some quick check. No,
right?
sorry, keep on going.
If something's credible, it's kind of believable, right? If
Right.
it's credible, it's believable. So it's interesting that credit cards, that same kind of thing, we postpone that experience. You buy something on credit, you postpone it. But the word to know in Latin is scire, and the root is part of consciousness. Okay, it's the same root word as to be conscious. And of course, to be conscious is to know, right? So I always liked, I think it's hard actually if you haven't followed Jung to understand why he would say, I don't have to believe
Yeah.
in this. I live in such alignment with my understanding of myself. I don't have to be in a believing state.
Mm.
I'm in a knowing state. And I think that's just wonderful for him to have
Well, it's
been
kind
in
of what
that.
we've lost, isn't it? Because we had this rational enlightenment, and it's about acquiring knowledge as well, isn't it? And it's about
Yes.
acquiring
Mm,
credentials and
mm,
so it's
mm.
acquisition. Whereas this idea that there's this knowing,
Yes.
that's something.
Yes. Yes. And you could see by the way he said it, it was it, that was a real authentic expression of his self, right? Of his capital S self. To be in a space where you just know. And it's interesting because, there's apocryphal stories around about how, Tony Wolfe wasn't able to do active imagination, these stories. But that she was an incredible analyst, incredible. And some people think that, and Marie Louise von Franz said that after a certain amount of work on the self, that you, like the Aboriginal peoples, that you live in such connection with the psyche, in alignment with your values, totally in alignment, that you don't need to do active imagination because it's right there in your sense of present. And this is
I find this is a confession, and maybe I should clip out and cut and edit this little bit that I'm going to save myself. But
no.
I used to teach meditation a long, long time ago in Sydney, and one thing I noticed was, I think in NLP they talk about different modes, visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and I think sometimes I don't find it easy to do active imagination. And I think sometimes visual people see a lot of things, and
Yes. Yes.
I mean, you've probably got a lot of experience from patients and clients and stuff like that. But I think sometimes, uh, other people can get the knowing in different ways, like in
Yes.
kinesthetic, in body awareness, or
Absolutely. 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 I totally agree. And it's not just visual. It can be olfactory, right?
mm,
It can be the very overwhelming sense of smell or an aroma that takes you back.
mm,
Refugees talk about the hardest thing is the smells of this new country.
right.
They miss the smells of their, baking and you know herbs that
Yeah,
they're
yeah.
accustomed to. So this is an incredibly powerful thing. And of course somatic, absolutely, somatic stuff is so resonant. There's a wonderful book called The Orphans something, Emily Rose. She's a Jungian analyst out of Los Angeles, I believe. And she, really an interesting story. She was adopted as a very young child. She grew up in Africa. And she had these kind of some scars on her body that she never really understood. And then through her analysis and her individuation, she became knowing that these scars were not really hers, that she kind of inherited these scars.
Right.
And it's her journey to understand these scars with respect to the wildebeest, in and these dreams she has that appear to be dreams that aren't really hers, right?
Mm,
They're dreams of a sense of place. And
mm,
so I think you're totally right. I think that we can be drawn, like in the movie Lion, right? He's drawn, what brings him back to his story is the smell of Indian pastry. He hadn't smelled it in
mm,
so long. And then all of a sudden, that's what brings him back to go, wait, I need to follow my story. I need to reclaim my origin story because I'm not at peace right now. I'm
mm,
not whole right now. Yeah.
mm. It's so primal. It's
Yes.
and maybe this is more of what we've lost. I might think in terms of the rational enlightenment that this kind of that the primacy of smell, or I remember in India them saying that Om is the original sound of the universe. That there are sometimes there's a sound that can just spark off something so old and
Yes.
ancient, like a
Ancient.
bell or something.
Exactly. And I think part of that story, John, is in Blake. Again, I've got a little rusty here on some of the sources, but a professor in Texas wrote a book on Jung in Africa, in his African journeys, right? And there was a morning that he woke up at dawn to see a whole kind of row of baboons who had their hands up while the sun was rising. And his shock was this primal, ancient, that goes back to the most primitive animal, right? Or animal nature, to be in harmony with the cycles of their life. How different or the same it was for him getting up to watch the sunrise and him turning his head and seeing this vision. And I think that's really significant, what you're saying. Yeah.
And I don't
Indeed.
know whether you've had a lot of experience with psychedelics, but it seems to me that somehow, sometimes psychedelics reawaken those kinds of experiences. That the
Yes.
sun coming up is a little bit like 2001 Space Odyssey, the
Yes.
first day of the
Yes.
cosmos, and somehow it
Yes.
takes. But I don't want to. I'm not kind of promoting it, but I'm just sort of saying that that's happening for a lot of people that way.
Indeed. And, even in Canberra, there's some studies going on now using psychobacillin for long-term depression, but also there's several studies about using it to prepare people for death, their anxiety around death, terminal patients. And it seems, and Stan Groff did a lot of this research in the 70s, and what it seems to do is open up pathways of experience mentally and physically. People talk about having sensations of oneness. And so it seems to have a very positive effect on people preparing for the next part of passing. So, yeah, I think there's a lot to be said. I personally do not have any experience in that because I don't think I need any help at all getting to these states.
It should be available to everyone except for Latin classics teachers
Or
because they're
meditators.
already.
Yeah, or meditators who've spent a long time meditating. I'm sure the Dalai Lama would decline and said, no. The Bardos are a really familiar territory for me, and I don't think I need any help getting there. We're touring. Yeah, it's interesting.
And what about just a little bit about, Jung's uncanny side? Because there is another element to it, isn't it? It's like there's that opening up that we've been talking about to the dead and to the ancient, but he did have it, and he had that in the family, didn't he? And
Absolutely. He had it in the family, in his culture, in his neighborhood. The Swiss culture was, they were communities of people who got together and did seances. That's what they did Saturday nights. That's how that was part of their communing. And of course, his cousin, Helene, was a seer herself. And that was the subject of his doctoral work. He was intrigued by this, totally intrigued by the ability, to see. And so I think that, and his own experiences of trying to excavate what was going on with him, with these very lucid, what seemed like memories or presences, like the number 2 personality, was, he really couldn't ignore it. He could not ignore it. And of course, we can pathologize that. We could diagnose that as being all sorts of, wrongness. But the very fact of it is he found a way through it himself through play therapy and through drawing. I mean, the Red Book is full
Yeah.
of his. No, I didn't know he was that good of an artist. I mean,
Yeah.
I'd been reading him, all of his writings, and then the Red Book came out, and we were
Yeah.
all amazed about
Mm.
how good he was. And so, through this process of connecting directly to the unconscious, through active imagination, through movement, through drawing, through play therapy, he became able to understand that number two much better within context, that he was connected to an ancestral line that
Yeah.
maybe went back all the way to the apes who were holding the baboons who were greeting the sun. Um, and he was also connected to the intellectual who wanted to inhabit a place in Swiss society of,
Yeah.
established intellectualism and the
Yeah.
ability to give back to his community. So I think, that uncanny side, yeah, he's got great ghost stories. Memories Dreams is full of them, right? And
And
his
clock stopping and things
yes,
like that. And
yes. The activity, all the activity in the house before seven sermons, the
mm,
haunting of his house,
mm,
wasn't just experienced by him. It was the whole family who experienced the hauntings. So
mm,
I think it was also the time period, that he was experiencing this. Also, we cannot underestimate the collective trauma of the World War. Okay, the world wars, both of them, but the First World War especially, his whole unfoldment happened in the 6 months preceding the World War. And he had big dreams forecasting this,
mm,
precognizant dreams. Shamdasani
mm,
even says these were experiences that he attributed to having a sense of things before they happened.
yeah.
And so we can't underestimate
Mm,
not only the pressure, but the great collective dis-ease of
mm,
Europe at the time,
mm,
knowing that something was coming, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He kept having the dreams. That could drive you a little crazy, right? and it did. So he did what a therapist knows how to do, and he went inward to try and manage and find that reserve, right? To manage
or
that.
in some people's language, if you took the word shaman, that
Oh,
this permeability
mm,
that he had is
yes.
like maybe what he was going through at that time with the upheaval of the Second World War, maybe it speaks to now as well. Like, some of the answers he's come up with in terms of I know when you were talking there, I was thinking, the drawing and the writing and it's like there's this challenge in this time, it seems to me. And the response for me has to involve the writing, the working
Mm.
with the using the hands or something. It's like I can't see myself not doing that in terms of this period,
Yeah,
because we talk about
engaging.
meditation and that's very true, but it's also the making.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And it's that response to your needs and being able to produce something that kind of soothes your soul, doesn't
Yeah,
it? It's in answer to the moment. That's why I think we have to keep, take good care of our artists. Our artists are standing right there at the unconscious.
yeah.
They're, and you said shaman, Marie Louise von Franz wrote this great essay, Was Jung a Shaman? And I think
Mm,
for all purposes, that's a very good way of looking at the way he worked.
mm,
Not only was he a professional shaman for, sitting with people in therapy, but he was a speaker for his community, wasn't he? Like
mm,
not only the Swiss community, but also the burgeoning new science of psychotherapy. He
mm.
was one of the first voices of that. It's interesting that Freud has much more traction in the academy than he does, but he's still really. I
Well,
when I
it's a bit
speak to
spooky
groups,
for people, speaking with the spirits and stuff. But if you see it in the shaman thing,
yeah,
the shamans speak to the spirits. They
yes,
reconnect people to the very old. They,
Yes.
You can kind of get it.
Absolutely.
Whereas
Absolutely.
Freud being clever in so many respects in terms of
Yes.
his theory, his intellectual theory, which you couldn't kind of there's two so very different people, aren't they? But
Yes.
in my book, Freud was kind of like trademarking his theory, and
Yes.
you couldn't kind of go out of it. Whereas Jung was just so permeable that, yes, that must have created many challenges, but it's also given him such incredible gifts that he's shared.
And so just getting back to what you were saying, John, just now, because I think it's such an important point about how we respond to the stresses, the global stresses now. And I think what he would have said is if you can find your story amidst this, and you can find a metaphor for this story and work with that metaphor, or work with a dream, or work with a symbol in a dream that really speaks to you, and you can work with that and craft it and express yourself in dance, in painting, in writing, in any way you want to, then
So
that
many different
is the
ways.
way you honor the psyche and honor your process. I think
Mm.
he would be really happy to know that we were all engaged in some way, in that way.
Mm. And that's a creative response.
Mm, indeed. So it's interesting that you have that need. A lot of people don't turn to that initially. They're all of this is in their head, and they're walking around trying to wade through this complexity in their head and show up in these different parts of their lives. And the fact that he was very at peace playing, the idea of play therapy, very
And
at
playing
peace.
is a beautiful topic. It's one that never had on this podcast, for example, but I remember Winnicott or whatever. And I can remember Jung saying things like, "The hands can solve what the head can't," and it's so
Mm-hmm.
true for something like writing, that if you're away from the computer, away from the
Mm-hmm.
writing, you can think about the problem or try to nut it out. But if the hands are moving, it's amazing how many times the problem is solved in the making.
It's true. Or it's a matter of sidelining yourself, taking yourself offline mentally, you
Yeah,
know, and engaging in a different process so that part of you can be offline,
yeah.
literally and figuratively. And that can really be helpful. And
And
it's
so what
not,
does this mean for sorry, I'm jumping, and I know we're probably going way over too, but for your clients, do you see this? I would imagine you begin to see a creative response in them. Does that happen?
I do. And part of what I try and really offer them are these
Mm,
other options of
mm,
managing their stresses, right?
mm,
To be open to doing things that they don't ordinarily do. And I often ask, tell me how you play. What is play for you? And of course,
mm,
more often than not, just blank. And I bring in some anecdotes about Jung. Jung
mm,
really felt that if you could reconnect to the joy of play. And so
mm,
sometimes people are very burdened by that. Like, oh my God,
mm.
I don't even.
Goes
And I say,
against some of the drill school conditioning.
right.
Mm,
Um, and then I say something simple, take a ball and
mm,
throw the ball against the wall at the house. Something so simple, and something you haven't done in a long
mm,
time, that
mm,
it loosens up a pattern of thinking that's not
mm,
helpful and it's not
mm,
helping you. And trying to think and reason your way out of this distress is not
mm,
working. This isn't the answer. This is
mm,
just a tool, right? It's
mm,
it's another version of a tool that can assist. And
mm,
playing, for adults is a really hard concept to wrap their mind around. Yeah.
mm, mm.
But I'm glad to hear that this is something that really works for you. It's important.
Well, I think thank you very much, Stephanie. That's so much there. And yeah, I think the whole topic of play is fantastic. And I feel that we gained a lot from the rational enlightenment. We don't want to give our Apple iPhones back. We like the electric cars, sort of,
Right, right.
except for the people that are burning them now. But, we're not saying that, but somehow simple things and
Yes,
profound things like
yes.
play,
Play. And that
like
worked
the
for Jung.
ancestors.
Play worked for him. He played and he built little, blocks and towns and little people. And that helped his process while he was processing things that he couldn't access, the unconscious content that he couldn't get, thinking his way towards it. It just
Yes,
was elusive to him. And so I think that these alternative ways are really useful if we can loosen up a little bit. Dancing, you know,
dancing
I,
is
I
good.
love
The
the
mosh
idea.
pit, going back
The
to the
mosh
mosh
pit.
pit. I know I'm a bit fixated on the mosh
No,
pit,
no, but
but
it's important. This whole mosh pit idea. I mean, for me, it's this image of the full moon rave,
yeah,
of people going out and dancing with no particular, point
yeah,
or focus, just
or
dancing for this.
outcome.
Yeah, exactly, just dancing, and so it's. I'm sure you've heard of this. These groups have popped up. No Lights, No Lycra is a group that on a Friday night, it's no drugs, no alcohol, and it's 2 hours of just come and dance in a space. Some places you do it in the morning on your way to work. So it's this,
Right?
idea, come and dance recreationally. It's dark, so no one's watching you. You just kind of express yourself. So I think it's a
It's
nice,
wonderful.
yeah.
This is the one last question. Where does the persona fit in all of this? Because I know I might have my own answer, but it seems to me that
Yes,
people are a little bit concerned about the number one personality and the number two personality. And the
yes,
number two personality is sometimes hidden away a bit, especially if someone's a
yes,
bit uncanny or whatever.
yes, yes.
But anyway, I have my answer. What would you say? Because it is a big question, persona, isn't it?
It is. I mean, well, how would you so you're saying,
Well,
what is the persona? How does the persona fit
well,
into?
my answer to that is that, like, I've heard people say, there was this huge battle in Jung between the one and the two, and I kind of get it, but I think he kind of resolved it in terms of
Yeah,
his expression in the world.
yeah, yeah.
Um, and I remember Hillman saying that the persona is the personality of the soul, and I think that that's a good answer.
That's a lovely answer. I love that. Or the persona is the changeable roles we play in our life. So you can have a persona that's a granddaughter, and a persona that's a teacher, and a persona that's, that it's a part of the roles that we inevitably inhabit in our lives, right? And it's how we show up in those roles. They don't necessarily have to change with respect to who you are, right? But we adapt, right? So I'm not going to be the same person going to go dance at a rave as I am when I go show up for a lecture, right? On
Right.
trauma. I mean, those
Yeah.
are two. I mean, Stephani's still there, right? It's
Yeah.
all a part of
It's,
me.
it's you knowing which dress to put on as the
Yes,
persona. Mm.
yes, that's how I kind of think. And it's the part of the personality that faces our relational
Mm.
connections.
Yeah.
That's how I would experience it, I think. But just a little bit more about the one and the two. I'm not sure I would say that the one and the two were, well, there was a time when they were in conflict because he
Yeah.
didn't know how to manage both of
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
And at the same time, the more attention to number two he
Mm.
got, the
Mm.
calmer number one became,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And therefore, he became comfortable with this idea that we need to address our unconscious in order
Yeah.
to individuate so that
Yeah.
number one can be at peace with our lives. Yeah.
Yeah.
In that way, that's
That's
how
nice.
I,
That's very
yeah,
nice.
yeah.
I have got one last. I've always got another question. Sorry,
This
but
is fun.
that's a sign of
This
a
is
good
fun.
conversation. If there's another question,
Yes. Yeah.
out of the pantheon, and I'm only using the Greek pantheon now, Of
Yes.
all the goddesses and the gods, uh, which one do you love? And I know there's
Um,
many. You might like many
there's
because it kind of
many.
goes back to that question, which is,
I like, there's aspects of Athena that I really, really like. Um, but she falls short for me in terms of her isolation, right? There's a bit of that isolation. And I think I relate to Venus, um, Aphrodite, that kind of Libran sensibility, the
mm,
kind of being able to be amidst people and feel the
mm,
warmth of
mm.
community and feel the warmth of conviviality. I like that. So probably those two. Those
That's
two.
not a bad mix,
Yeah.
Athena and Aphrodite, Venus.
Yeah.
But
What about what about
I
you?
just on that for 1 second though, I think the beauty is so much needed at this time too, isn't it? Like, and sometimes the beauty is through the words and how people speak, and
Mm,
scholars can have extreme beauty in terms of
yes,
the way
absolutely.
they put things across and they enter. That's what I've noticed. And um, yeah, but
Being
beauty is
mellifluous.
we need it to live at the moment. I
That's
think for me, I can see a little bit of the Hermes in there, and I can
oh,
see a little bit of the Dionysian. Like I get excited when Lorca said,
mm,
the
mm,
duende
yeah.
comes up through the feet. I kind of like that whole earth
Yes.
uh, thing.
Yes. And the Bacchanalian feast, the Bacchanalian party. I love that too.
But you
I
got to be
love it.
careful when you say that. Like I always have to put a rider there somewhere.
Did you ever read The Secret History by Donna Tartt?
No.
Oh, John, you have to read that. That's amazing. And it's about a group of friends who are classics students at a small university in the States.
Yeah.
And it's really, really good. I would recommend it.
One thing I've been thinking lately is I've been writing about the 60s, and then I see this movement from the 60s to the New Age. It's all Hillman said the US is very poor, and I'd say there's a lot of elements of Australia which are very poor, in the
Yeah,
thing.
yeah, yeah.
And then there was the New Age, and then there was the East.
Mhm.
And I find this one other thing about the old is that there's this tradition in the West.
Mhm.
Obviously you got onto it at a young age, but I think many people missed it. People went looking for spirituality in the East, basically, didn't they? And
Mhm.
then this whole Western tradition has been opening up, that there were these Neoplatonists, that there was these Orphics, that there were these dream incubators, and
Yes,
this is one of the good things about the net, because it's all kind of been, well, you can get it online. It takes you 1 or 2 seconds.
right, right. Um, yeah, it's
Yes and
it's
no.
the it's the pulse of humanity and its expression of itself, isn't it? It's the times that are kind of propelling humanity towards their fullest expression. Yeah, tweak it here and tweak it there, and the contours change slightly, but there's this pull to experience
Mm,
um, in all these different ways the expression of humanity so that it
mm,
can become the most that it can be. But you're right about the United States. It's in a very adolescent phase. It is very adolescent in the way it conducts itself. And at the
and,
same
and and
time,
we can't be adolescent anymore. It's almost like
mm,
the time is not allowing. It's a midlife. Well, Rick Carner says it's a rebirth mystery, and
yes,
it's somehow, like it or not,
yes.
um, we've been thrown into the death rebirth mystery.
And like on top of that,
Mm,
we've just ended the Kali Yuga. Is that how you
mm,
pronounce it? The Kali
yeah,
Yuga. And it changes once every 12,000 years. And it's
mm,
just this year ended. I mean, I'm paying attention to that. Something that happens once every 12,000 years. We all might want to sit up. And it coincides with the Western perspective of the age of Aquarius, which, if you're writing about the 60s,
Mm,
That's kind of, quintessential expression of the age of Aquarius,
mm.
isn't it? In addition to this, the fact that the internet is this kind of collection of humanity, that also is an expression of the age of Aquarius. So what we do with this now, right, is going
Yeah.
to be really
Well, I think a
interesting.
lot of what you said earlier about the experiential and the doing and the
Mm-hmm.
meaning, if for Jung it was awakening the gods, for us it's like, okay, you had to be a rich person to kind of get Ficino's writings in the Renaissance, probably. Whereas
Yes,
now you can get it within about 3 minutes. But
exactly.
what do you do with Ficino's writings, or
Yes.
the Neoplatonists or whatever?
Mm.
And can you build ways, rituals in your life, ways of expression
Mm.
that grounded in the soul of your everyday life? That's kind of more like the question.
Exactly. Exactly. It's like the antithesis is, well, it's okay to have free love, but if it's just free love, then there's no container for it and it's
Mm,
just spills, right?
mm,
So if we have the expression of free love in the 60s, how does
mm,
that free love mature
mm.
into a structure or an expression that is the best of that unto
Yeah,
itself, right?
yeah, that's
Mm-hmm.
good. Well, let's finish on free love.
Okay, let's. It sounds wonderful. John, this was so lovely. Thank you for the invite. Thank you so
That,
much.
thank you.